I thought it would be fun if Jonah Jameson, the publisher of The Bugle, could be used as an extra foe for Spider Man, but also for humor. Jameson is so neurotically hateful, or he hates Spider-Man so much that he'll go to any length to destroy him. So even when things are going good for Spider-Man, Jameson would write editorials against him and saying the police should catch him, and he was a vigilante, and New York has no room for vigilantes, and he's obviously a criminal, or why doesn't he tell people who he is? And Spider-Man would always taunt Jameson, and I would try to get a lot of humor into their relationship, too. I wrote stories where Jameson would be in danger, and Spider-Man would save his life. Instead of being grateful, Jameson would accuse Spider-Man of having set up the whole thing just to impress Jameson. There was nothing Spider-Man could do to get on Jameson's good side. But as Peter Parker, Spider-Man worked for Jameson as a freelance photographer selling photographs. And Jameson would often be talking to Peter Parker, telling him how much he hated Spider-Man, and I think the readers enjoyed that little byplay between them. In the story where Spider-Man had amnesia due to Dr. Octopus, and only one girl could help Spider-Man, who knew the story, who knew the secret, a little girl named Tina. I thought it would be great to show this little girl tragically running around trying to get people to listen to her, to believe her, and nobody would. Nobody would pay attention because once again, I felt that's the way young people feel. They feel nobody listens to them. Nobody pays attention. So I thought the average viewer would relate to a situation like that, and I think I was right. One thing you always try to do in a story is make the villain more powerful than the hero. As I mentioned before, if the hero catches a litter bug, nobody's impressed. Or if he catches a regular burglar or something like that. So you have to make the villain, seem to be even more powerful, because the best thing, the thing the audience, the viewer, the reader, depending whether it's a cartoon, a book, or what, the thing your audience most enjoys is trying to figure out, how is he going to get out of this? It's impossible. He doesn't have a chance. So by making the villain apparently in control and more powerful, you build up the suspense and you hold the viewer's interest. Well, the Green Goblin, to all intents and purposes, should have been Spider-Man's superior, because as Norman Osborn, a very intelligent businessman, more than a businessman, he was the head of a cartel. I mean, he was the Bill Gates of his industry. So he certainly was Spider-Man's equal, if not superior, in intelligence. As the Green Goblin, he had that silly little goblin glider that was rocket-propelled, that he would ride, that could go a zillion miles an hour, it looked like, and he could control it magnificently. He had all these little goblin bombs and things that he would drop, and anything he needed, I gave him a bomb for that purpose. If he needed nobody to see him, he had a smoke bomb, which would obliterate him. If he had to go through a wall, he had a destructo bomb. He'd throw it at the wall, and it would melt. I mean, we just made up anything. So how on earth could Spider-Man beat somebody like that? Well, you'll have to see the cartoon, but he beat him. I always felt it's not a bad idea if you can do a little preaching in these books, because I always knew that a lot of comics were read by very young people. And I would have felt good about it if it would have some salutary effect. So I tried to put little morals underneath the stories. One thing that I was very careful of it with Spider-Man, even though he was just a 17-year-old hard luck kid, I made him a very smart kid. And I made him a scholarship student and a science major. And what I was really trying to do was in a subliminal way, let the reader know, hey, it's okay to be smart, and even a scientist can be a hero. Well, in this particular story, Peter enables a young man to triumph over the villain, over Big Wheel, by encouraging him intellectually, by teaching him science and letting the boy's knowledge of science be what defeats the villain. And I always like that angle. As I was mentioning, that I don't think it hurts to put a little moral tone or a little lesson in these stories. And maybe that's what I was after with the whole Spider-Man bit. Because once again, if you remember the beginning, Peter Parker, as smart as he was, I think he reacted like any young person would. Wow, I've got a superpower. I can make money with it. I'll get all the women. I'll do anything I want. But then he realized that because he didn't care about other people, because he let that robber escape, something terrible happened. His uncle died. And then he realized with great power comes great responsibility. And that was probably the most blatant bit of preaching that I have put in a comic. I've always tried to be more subtle than that, but I did try, again, knowing that young people read these books, I tried to show that the most important thing to think of is to do the right thing. It doesn't matter whether you're just an ordinary kid, you're not particularly good at anything, you're not super, you're not the world's greatest student or the world's greatest athlete, or whether you're Mr. Wonderful. You can do anything better than anybody. The important thing is the young kid with no special power who does the right thing is more of a hero than the guy with all the power in the world who doesn't do the right thing. And if that little message can come across, then I feel the whole bit about Spider-Man has been worthwhile. I've told the story so often that for all I know it might even be true, but I had just done the Fantastic Four comic book, a group of superheroes, and I wanted to create something else, but I wanted it to be just one hero. And I was trying to think, what superpower could I give him? Because, as you can imagine, the superpower is the key to the whole thing. And I figured, well, we already have somebody who's very strong. We have characters who can fly. Well, what can I do? And I saw a fly crawling on the wall, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to have somebody who can crawl on walls? Except I probably didn't say, wouldn't it be cool? Because that was so many years ago, I probably said, wouldn't it be groovy? At any rate, I thought that would be a good idea. Next, I needed a name. So I thought, well, how about Mosquito Man? Nah, that didn't sound good. Fly Man? Nah. Insect Man? That was worse. And finally, running down a list of things I could think of that crawled on walls, I came to Spider-Man. And somehow it sounded dramatic to me and mysterious. And lo, a legend was born. I lived in New York, and Marvel Comics was in New York. And I had lived in New York all my life, so as you can imagine, I knew it pretty well. So whenever I wanted to create a new hero, I naturally based him or her in New York because it made it easy for me to write the stories. And I never wanted to do what the competition did. I never wanted to make up things like if the Human Torch, Johnny Storm, the teenager, if he was driving a sports car, I wouldn't have him drive a whiz-bang V8. I'd have him drive a Chevy Corvette. And if Spider-Man went to a movie, I wouldn't want him to go to the Bijou, or I have him go to the Radio City Music Hall. Or I tried to use real and addresses. I had Spider-Man live in Forest Hills, and there is a Forest Hills in New York. He didn't live in every town or small town or Gotham City. Forest Hills, New York. So by having all the characters that I worked on living in New York, it occurred to me as I did the different books, why not occasionally have them meet? And why not let it be like a Marvel universe? All our characters live in the same area. In fact, one thing I did that I really got a kick out of, I don't even remember what book it was. Maybe it was the Fantastic Four. But there was a ball game. And in the stadium, I think it was a ball game, it was some big event, and a photographer had to cover the event. So just for fun, I told the artist to draw Peter Parker and let him be the photographer. Now, it wasn't a Spider-Man story, but we needed a photographer. Peter Parker is a photographer. What could be more natural? So I tried to do that a lot. We have a character called Daredevil, a blind lawyer. And I think maybe it was a Spider-Man story, but yes, I think it was. In one Spider-Man story, Peter Parker needed a lawyer. So he went to Matt Murdock, who was really Daredevil. And Daredevil didn't have much to do with the story. It was just a few panels. But I thought it was fun to have him go to another one of our characters and make it seem as if it's all real, as if they all really exist. You know, I'm my own biggest fan. And I think the superpower that we came up with is just great. The idea of a guy who can crawl on walls and shoot webs. But besides that, I'd like to think one of the reasons for Spider-Man's popularity is the fact that the average reader can relate to him. And certainly in the beginning, he's no longer a teenager. Over the years, he's grown. But when we started him, he was a teenager. And he had a lot of problems. And, you know, up until then, most superheroes, there were hardly, I don't remember ever reading a superhero story where the hero had to worry about making a living or worry about a relative who was ill or anything like that. Or even had trouble with women. The girls all loved them because they were superheroes. So to be different, I gave Peter Parker, and I shouldn't really say this because I'm giving away a secret, but you know, Peter Parker is Spider-Man. So at any rate, I gave Peter Parker as many problems as I could. He was not a popular kid. I think when the series started, I had him about 17 years old. He wasn't very popular. The other kids considered him something of a nerd. He fell heir to all the, or rather, he was subject to all the ills that flesh is heir to. He had dandruff. He'd get an ingrown toenail that bothered him. His costume would tear when he was fighting a villain. He'd have an allergy attack. I mean, anything I could think of to make him seem real. And I think that the readers enjoyed that because they could imagine, hey, that could be me. You know, there was another thing that happened accidentally, but I think it turned out to be good. When Steve Ditko designed his costume, Steve, of course, was the artist I worked with who co-created the character with me. When Steve Ditko designed his costume, he gave him a full face mask so that nothing showed. You never saw his flesh. His hands were covered, his feet, his legs, everything. Well, we just did it because it looked like a good costume. But I realized later it made it easy for anybody to empathize with Spider-Man. He could have been a black kid under that costume. He could have been Hispanic. He could have been Indian. He could have been Asian. He could have been anything. And I think, as I say, that was just, we did it by accident, but I'm very glad it turned out to be a good choice. I think the idea of people relating to a hero and even thinking that could be me is incredibly important. I think once you've established that, you have a hit on your hands. You could have the strongest character in the world. You could have a character with every superpower known to man. But if he's not somebody you care about or believe in or would like to be like, then it's nothing. I remember when I was a kid, I used to go to all the Errol Flynn movies. And there was just something about Errol Flynn, whether he played Robin Hood or the mayor of Dodge City or what, the story, the way he portrayed the characters. I wanted to be Errol Flynn, you know? And so I think it's important in doing a superhero character that the character should be somebody that the reader would say, gee, that could be me. I wish I were him. He reminds me of me. He has all the problems that I have. Well, you know, every character, I guess, needs motivation. And I thought to myself, if I were somebody who had a superpower, if I had, and I love this phrase, the proportionate strength of a spider, which of course means if a spider was as large as I am, that's how strong I'd be. And if I could crawl on walls and do all those great things, why would I want to spend my life, risk my life, fighting bad guys? So I thought I've got to give him a reason. So in the beginning, when he became Spider-Man, there was a time when somebody who had just robbed an office ran past him. And the person who was chasing the robber yelled to Spider-Man, "Hey, stop him, just for a minute until I can get there." And Spider-Man figured, hey, I don't want to get involved. It isn't my problem. And he let the guy go. Well, when Spider-Man went home that night, Peter Parker went home, he found that his uncle, who was like a father to him because his parents were dead and he lived with his aunt and uncle, he found that his uncle had been murdered by a robber, a burglar who had come into the house. Well, you can imagine how he felt, this uncle whom he loved and so forth. But then he later found out that the murderer was the same robber that he had let run past him. And if he hadn't let him run by, if he had just stopped him for a moment, his uncle would still be alive. So Peter had this terrible feeling of guilt, and he felt he would spend the rest of his life atoning for this mistake that he had made. He felt he owed it to the memory of his uncle and to the world in general to use his power for good. And I wrote this one sentence, which I'm happy to say, people have repeated it for years. I had him say, "I realize now," or I think some phrase like that. I forget what led into it, but the sentence was, "I know now, with great power comes great responsibility." And they've got that in the movie that they're making and everything. So that makes me very proud. In no way did I ever suspect that Spider-Man would become the world-famous popular hero that he is today. At the time that we did him, just another character that we had made up, and I hoped the book would sell so that I would keep my job and not get fired. And after I did Spider-Man, I went on and I did other characters, and I never thought much about it until it was later on when the sales figures came in and we realized how incredibly well the book had sold. And then, little by little, newspapers started writing about Spider-Man. I remember there's a newspaper in New York called the Village Voice, sort of an avant-garde newspaper, a trendy paper, or it was then. And they were the first one, I think, to write about Spider-Man after a few issues had been out. And they were the first one. They referred to him as an anti-hero. Because, again, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but not only did I want to make him as realistic as possible, but in order to be realistic, I thought, if there's some fellow in a costume crawling on buildings and beating up villains and so forth, I don't think the police would like him. They'd say, they don't like vigilantes. They don't want anybody doing their work for them. So Peter, well, not Peter, Spider-Man was not a very popular hero. Some people thought he was a bad guy. Why does he not tell anybody who he is? Why does he wear that mask? And why does he go crawling around rooftops in the dark of night? So even though the reader knew he was a good guy, it lent another bit of interest, I thought, that the police were never sure of him. I think that the cartoons that are on this DVD are perhaps a little happier, a little simpler, a little easier to take, perhaps, than some of the current storylines in the magazines, because since the cartoons were made, the whole world has gotten a little bit grimmer, a little bit darker. Movies have, even newspapers have, and the comic books have followed that line. The comic books always reflect the tenor of the times, or maybe the times reflect the comic books, I don't know. But so you'd find that there's a slight difference in the attitude in the cartoons. They're a little cheerier, perhaps, than the stories that are running now. They're not better, they're not worse, just a little different. The mood is different. And I think that they're very enjoyable to watch. I'm hoping that 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 100 years from now, and I might not even be here 100 years from now, you never know, but I'm hoping that he'll still be going strong, because there will always be new young artists and writers coming up who are always going to have new ideas and new angles and new ways to portray Spider-Man that will be just right for the era they're living in. So it seems to me that with luck, the character can go on longer than we can. People always ask me if there are any similarities between myself and Spider-Man. And I think there are similarities between me and every character I've ever written, mainly because I try to write characters who, to me, seem like real people. I would like to think that I'm a real person. There have to be similarities. I mean, Spider-Man, or Peter Parker, he was in love with his girlfriend. I was in love with my girlfriend. He eventually married her. I eventually married mine. He always felt he wasn't making enough money. Nobody will ever convince me I get paid enough. and on and on. I mean, nothing ever turns out quite right for Peter. Nothing ever turns out quite right for me. I'm sure when I see the DVD that I'm doing now, I'm going to say, oh, why didn't I say this and why did I say that? Nothing is ever perfect. So, yeah, Peter Parker reminds me a lot of me. Well, it's a funny thing. I never thought of myself as somebody recognizable. But I guess I've done so many of these kind of videos or DVDs, and I've had my picture here and there in newspapers and other places. I do find now, occasionally in a restaurant or on the street, somebody will come over to me and say, hey, aren't you Stan Lee? And I've got to be honest, I enjoy it. I mean, it's like when somebody asks me for an autograph. To me, that's the most flattering thing in the world. I know a number of actors and directors, and very often they'll say to me, I hate it when someone asks for an autograph. I can't understand that. I mean, the fact that another human being cares enough that he'd want a sample of your handwriting, of your autograph, to me is the greatest thing. I mean, I'm not a world-famous celebrity, but the little bit of attention that I've been getting lately, I find it very gratifying, and I'm very appreciative of it. I stopped writing Spider-Man after, I don't know, the first 100 issues or so. But Obviously, other writers have taken it over, and other artists and other editors from time to time. Now, each new person or group of people that is responsible for the Spider-Man strip puts his own or their own style on the strip. They tell it from their own perspective in their own way. So in a sense, the strip keeps evolving, it keeps growing, it changes with the times. There are people now in their 20s working on the strip. Well, they bring the point of view of 20-year-olds living in today's world to the strip. So it never really gets stale. It's always being written and drawn by people who are connected with today's mores and attributes and so forth. And I think that's one reason it stays fresh and it stays current and up to date. Yeah, you know, it is hard to let go. It is, what happened was there was a period of about, 10 or 15 years or something, maybe 10 years, when I was writing most of the strips. And then I became the publisher, and as publisher I had so many other duties, I couldn't keep writing the stories. And I must admit, I became a publisher very reluctantly, and I envied the writers who then would hop in and take over the stories. And for the first few issues of anything I saw, I would think, oh, gee, I would have done it better than that, or, oh, what's he trying to do? He's killing my character. But it took me maybe a couple of months to get out of that mindset and then to be able to appreciate the good job that these other guys were doing. And no, I don't think about it I don't think anymore about, oh, I'm not writing them, and because I keep so busy with other things. I did write, just recently, I wrote the comic book version of the Spider-Man movie. I wrote the Spider-Man comic book, which is based on the movie, and oh, that was a lot of fun. Every time I read a story with a little idea that I hadn't thought of, I say, darn, why didn't I do that? Every time I see Spider-Man drawn in a certain different style, I'll say, because I used to be the art director, I'll say, why didn't I tell the artist to do it that way? So everything I see, I love artists and writers. I love working with them, and I love looking at what they do, because there are always surprises. And at Marvel, I must say, we hire the very best that we can find. And we just literally have a bunch of geniuses doing these strips. You know, sometimes when I think about it, it's hard to believe. It was 40 years ago that we started Spider-Man. Why, and it's still going on. It's stronger than ever. There are no radio shows or serials. There are no television series. There are no movie franchises that have lasted that long without an interruption. I guess Spider-Man is one of the longest-lasting, successful series of all, and that's kind of nice.